You're listening to Indus here on BBC Radio Manchester and BBC Radio Lancashire, and my name's Talat Farooq Awan, just in case you missed it in the jingle. But the time now, it's 7:30. Now, a new book by a Manchester writer charts the story of how India is using space technology to drive a developing nation into the 21st century. The Indian space program, India's incredible journey from third world to first, is the latest offering from author Gurbir Singh, and I'm really pleased to say Gurbir joins me in the studio. Hello.
Good evening, Talat.
How are you? You're right?
I'm excellent, thank you.
Well, thank you very much for coming in and taking time out. Now, this is quite a thick book, isn't it? And it looks like a lot of hard work has gone into this. So what led you to write a book about the Indian space program?
Well, I always wanted to read a book to learn about the Indian space program, and at the time, there wasn't one. So that really was the motivation to write it.
Right, okay. And what about yourself personally? Was it a real keen interest about space itself?
I've been interested in space and astronomy since childhood. And indeed, from the very first book, which is just about the journey of the very first cosmonaut to Manchester, of all places. Yuri Gagarin came here in 1961. And I only found out about the fact that he had been here in 2010. And I looked around for a book, and again, there wasn't one, so I wrote that first book for the same motivation as well.
Right, okay. So something clearly you're quite passionate about. In terms of when you're doing research for a book, how rigorous is your research then, and what sort of process do you have to go through?
Well, I write part-time, so that's one of the reasons why it took, in this case, 6 years to write it.
Wow.
Part of it involved visiting India on 3 separate research trips, and I visited some archives, institutions, museums, and I suppose the most interesting element of the research was meeting people directly involved in the activities, especially in the early days of generating all the building of the infrastructure that's led to today's very complex and sophisticated infrastructure where India now builds, designs, launches and operates remote sensing satellites, communication satellites, navigation satellites, and in fact there is a space telescope, much more than that, which India is operating in Earth orbit, and indeed there is a spacecraft in the orbit of Mars as we speak.
Right. Now, because you sound like you're a real expert in this particular area, how much of an in-depth understanding as a punter, as a reader, do we need to have in order to understand your book?
Well, the way I've structured it is the first third of it is all about the history in the early days, about how science and technology developed, going back to Tipu Sultan, who used rockets in warfare in the early days.
Right.
It's the middle bit's really, I suppose, the technology bit. That's a bit that interests me. There are 9 appendices which help people understand some of the terminology. But I've assumed just about every technical term I've introduced with a bit. I'm introduced with a bit of an introduction for those people who are not familiar. And the final bit is all about how and why India is doing this, how it fits into the bigger picture of a nation that really shouldn't in many ways have started doing something like this, but ended up with a first world infrastructure on a very modest budget at the end of the day, and it's now providing for much of the certainly the middle class of the Indian population with services which compare with the first world, and indeed many of the rural communities also have access to services supported by space-based infrastructure which they otherwise wouldn't.
Right. Now, when you when you set out to write a book, I take it, did you go to India and did you meet the relevant people, and what did they have to say about your endeavours?
Well, they were quite very, very supportive. During the 3 trips, I visited Sikkim, very up north in northern parts of India, where one of the very earliest rocket enthusiast was working during the 1930s and 40s. Now, not many people know about this character who tested rockets as a means of transport long before ISRO, the Indian Space Research Organization, set up. They really initiated the space program in India on the 21st of November with the very first launch of a rocket from Indian soil into space. But in Sikkim in the 1930s and 40s, somebody was doing that. I also went down to Kerala, way down south, which is essentially the very birthplace of the cradle of the Indian space program, where that rocket I mentioned in November 61 took off from, a place called Thumba. Now that's incorporated into a very large, in fact the largest site within the Indian Space Research Organization, called the Vikram Sarabhai Space Center. I also went to a place called the Satish Dhawan Space Center, or Sriharikota as it's sometimes called. That's on the east coast of India, just 100 kilometers north of Chennai, and that's where every rocket that's gone into space from India has been launched from, that's gone into Earth orbit, indeed to the Moon and Mars as well.
And when you went there, was it a real buzz?
It was, actually. I was treated exceptionally well. They were quite keen to, because although India is well known for producing some spectacular achievements on modest budgets, they don't really spend all that much money talking about what they're doing, and their publicity departments are not as well funded as those in Europe, for example, the European Space Agency, or indeed NASA. So I suppose for them to have something that's, as you see in the book in front of you, it's fairly detailed. It's not comprehensive, but fairly detailed composition of everything that they do is helpful to them.
Right. Now, people have been very kind. They've done my work for me, and I have a list of questions which you put out there, and this is via Facebook, so I hope the individuals don't mind me mentioning their names.
Yes,
if that's okay. And so let's go through some of these questions, because they are questions I would have eventually moved on to. And Jean has a question: why do you think it's important to spend money on space research when people are starving?
It's a very common question, yeah, and it is something that really intrigued me as well. The way that economies develop around the world, those which are successful are based on technology and science. And it was very important for the very first president, the Prime Minister of India, Jawaharlal Nehru, to initiate India's post-independence development focused on the heart of science and technology. If they didn't choose that route, Nehru was convinced that it would be a very slow progress. And by doing that, for example, India now has satellite television, direct home broadcasting. If in the absence of that, the only alternative would have been traditional TV masts. And India's a huge place. It's very difficult to construct an infrastructure on that scale. And satellite offer a very optimal solution. And the bottom line is this, I guess. If India didn't have a space program, either they would have to do without those services or buy them in. And of course, when you buy them in, you have to be flexible with, you have to go with whatever pricing and availability and reliability your suppliers offer you. And India's always been has always placed self-reliance at the forefront, and every nation, I guess, would do that. And that's one of the reasons why it's recently, it's almost complete now, gone and installed its own, they call it GPS, but it's actually a regional version of GPS. Rather than use the American or other nations, it's self-reliant and has its own GPS system. It also has search and rescue services, which are supported through space-based infrastructure as well.
Right. So, in other words, there's a lot of good that comes from India investing in space as opposed to the negatives.
Absolutely, and indeed, the education, healthcare, farming, fishing, town planning, all of these services are supported by the spacecraft that India has in orbit right now.
Okay, well, Gurbir, stay with us. What we're going to now do is find out what's happening on the region's roads. Here's Nick Arkell.
BBC Radio Manchester and BBC Radio Lancashire Travel Update.
Traffic is fine on the M60, no problems on the motorways generally, not too bad on the M6. Actually, it's a slight lie there, it's still a little bit slow on the M67, but things are getting a lot better now towards the end of the motorway into Mosham. It's almost completely clear. It's slow through Levenshulme on both sides of the A6, quite heavy traffic through there. Things are okay through Manchester city centre, Regent Road coming in, that's improving. And it's fine through Lancashire with local routes as well. Can't see any delays on the Fylde coast through Lancaster's one-way system. All on the move from what I can see. If you're heading on to the trains, nothing unexpected going on. Of course, lots of engineering works as usual, but no specific delays through Manchester Piccadilly like we had earlier on. And that's the latest.
BBC Radio Manchester and BBC Radio Lancashire.
Now, my special guest in the studio today is Gurbir Singh, and we're talking about his new book, The Indian Space Programme, India's Incredible Journey from the Third World Towards the First. And it is quite an incredible journey when you consider India as a third world country. In terms of businesses, it's in its economy, it's doing very well. And we were taking questions from individuals, and these are some questions that have come via Facebook. And Jean was asking whether it was important to spend money on space research. And the other question she had to that was, what's the most important achievement of the Indian space program? So if you could, which you've touched on, I suppose.
Yeah, actually, I think this is a very interesting question, and different people will have a different view on this. My response would be the very bold ambition that the founding fathers for this space program had right at the outset. This is going back into early 1960s. The idea, 15 years after independence, the idea that such a developing nation should have a space program was just crazy, reckless concept even. And yet, in the intervening 55 years, it succeeded beyond their initial objectives, and it's gone way beyond that by now.
Right. And just a connecting question from Jean, and this is from Andy Green, and he says, why does a country with a space program still need so much foreign aid for the basics of life? So it's almost a case of, balancing the books, isn't it? In one hand, you're going to spend a hell of a lot of money on the space program, and yet humans, the average individual is struggling, and yet we still need foreign aid to help them, and, that's an interesting one.
Yeah, it is. And again, it's another one that intrigued me. And of course, when you dig down, you find actually the reality is a little bit more different. Sure, India does receive, in fact, up until about 2 years ago, India used to get about $300 million of aid from Britain. Now, that's been declining. I thought it had stopped by now, but it's certainly much reduced by now. But India itself is now a net donor of international aid, not a recipient. India has donated, has pledged $10 billion towards development projects in Africa, committed $1 billion to Afghanistan for its fight against terrorism and rebuilding, and it's contributed to over $800 million to students from 156 developing countries to study in Indian universities. And this means that in terms of its local region, for Bhutan, Bangladesh, Nepal, Sri Lanka, it's a net donor of aid, not a recipient. And in the last quarter of a century, last 25 years of the last century, India's poverty reduced from 50% to 25%. And if you think about space and poverty, well, just the fact that India has a space program doesn't necessarily mean that it can eradicate poverty. The United States, has for the last 20, 30 years, has had a poverty level of about between 10 and 15% consistently. And of course, it spends much, much more on its space program.
Yeah, fair point there, I suppose. Nicholas Stegel, question. Have India begun discussions for India to resume manned spaceflight to the future space stations of China and Russia, or indeed the lunar orbital outposts, either on shared spacecraft or a future Indian manned spacecraft?
Well, India's not really got currently a manned space program, and it's never really had one. I suppose of Indian origin, there have been 6 individuals that have been to space. 2 women, Sunita Williams and Kalpana Chawla. They went to space as American citizens. Each one had 2 space missions. Kalpana Chawla was went to space twice, 1997 and 2003 in the space shuttle, and sadly during the 2003 mission, during her return journey, there was a catastrophic failure and all 7 astronauts were lost. She's very well highly regarded in India. She was born in a town called Karnal in Punjab. I think now it's in Haryana. But Sunita Williams, she's still an active participant in NASA. She's been into the International Space Station twice. And during those 2 missions, she's clocked up an amazing 320 days in space.
Wow, I'm jealous.
That's almost a year. And during that time, she's also clocked up 50 hours in 7 spacewalks. And she's really one of the most experienced astronauts. But she was the product of a Serbian and her mother was Serbian, her father was from Gujarat, but they both settled in America where Sunita Williams was born. Right. 2 of the other astronauts who never made it to space were ISRO engineers, N.C. Bhatt and P. Radhakrishnan. They were supposed to go on board Space Shuttle to help launch an Indian satellite as payload specialists, but their mission was due in late 1986, and in early 1986, unfortunately, the Challenger disaster, the very first one to befall the Space Shuttle program, again, another 7 astronauts were lost, meant that the American government cancelled the travel of foreign astronauts on the Space Shuttle. And the only astronaut who was of Indian origin who's been to space is a guy called Rakesh Sharma. He spent just over a week in space in 1984, and he trained along with Ravish Malhotra in Star City in Moscow. They went up with the Russians, and so far the only person who's been to space is Rakesh Sharma. And guess what? They're making a film about Rakesh Sharma. About
time, I suppose, really, isn't it?
Yeah. And guess who's playing the lead role?
Who's that going to be? It's not you, is it?
No, it's SRK himself.
Okay,
Shah Rukh Khan.
Shah Rukh Khan, really?
It's supposed to be the film is supposed to start near the end of this year, so by early next year, or sometime next year, you could have an all singing and dancing astronaut on the screen.
Oh, great. That's fantastic, isn't it? Bollywood in space.
Absolutely. Looking forward to that.
That'll certainly be very good. I mean, I've always had a passion. I'm a bit of a sci-fi geek.
Oh, yeah.
I love Star Wars, Star Trek and all that sort of stuff. And I would love to go to space if I had the opportunity, and I suppose the health as well, really. Or at least have my coffin sort of, shot out into space. But what about you? Are you a sci-fi fan? Where does your real interest stem from? Is it a childhood ambition to be an astronaut?
Well, I did have a go.
Right.
I suppose of all the jobs that I've tried to get and failed, one that I'm proud of is back in the late 80s. You probably not old enough to remember this, but there was an advert. It said astronaut required, no experience necessary, and that was in the UK. And Helen Sharman eventually got that role, and she went into the Mir space station, and she spent 2 weeks there back in just before the USSR broke up. So I've always had an interest in space. I've had an interest in aviation, and I've now got into writing books.
Well, I suppose that's probably the next best thing, isn't it? Really, I suppose.
Certainly at my age. Yes.
Well, it's been a pleasure speaking to you, Gurpreet. I wish I had more time to continue our chat because I love space and there's quite a few questions.
Well,
but hopefully we will sort of, maybe catch up in the near future and have more of a discussion.
In fact, I've got the book launch happening on Friday this week.
Okay, and where's that taking place?
It's happening at the International Society. It's just across the road from the Students' Union on Oxford Road, and it's a free, open event, open to the public, and anybody can come along, and you don't need to buy a book, and there's some drinks and nibbles as well.
Right, lovely. That's a great offer, and the book is now available, I take it?
It's available in paperback, hardback, and of course, ebook.
Right, lovely. That's the Indian Space Programme by Gurpreet Singh. Thank you very much for taking time out.